Hello, everybody. Catherine, I'm going to promote you to co-host. There we go. And now make co-host. Yes. There we go. So, Catherine, you should be able to share screen and audio at your leisure. I hope.
Oops, I was chatting away there, but I hadn't unmuted myself.
Good. Glad you're with us, and attendees are arriving now. Good.
Great.
And we are recording, so thank you to those watching at home. So as it's 4 o'clock, I'll start by welcoming everybody to the third in our series of UCD Newman Center for the Philosophy, or for the Study of Religions, excuse me, online public lecture series. And I'm very pleased to say that today we have my dear colleague, Associate Professor Katherine O'Donnell from UCD School of Philosophy, who will be speaking on why she is not a Buddhist. Exactly. So I'm really looking forward to this, and thank you very much, Katherine, and take it away.
Okay, hello everybody. Sorry I can't see any of you, I just trust you're there. Let me share my screen and I'm going to talk through some PowerPoint slides. And how I've planned this is I hope to speak just for 30 minutes, maybe even a little less. I'm afraid I'm one of those lecturers who, once she starts talking, finds it really difficult not to speak for less than 50 minutes. So let's see if I can keep it to 20-30 minutes, and that allows some really good opportunities then for chatting further. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see my slides. Here we are. Let me make the slideshow more interesting. Okay, I'll play from the start. Now, why I am not a Buddhist. So I take my title from a very recent book, very interesting book by Evan Thompson, published this year by Yale University Press. And the overview of the talk is, I'll look at Thompson's book very briefly and in less detail than it deserves, to be honest, in order to get to look at where he levels most of his critique in the book, and that's at what he terms Buddhist modernism. And I'll be making an argument that he doesn't fully capture what I understand as Buddhist modernism in his critique. And then I'm going to end with Buddhism as I understand it, and the ways in which I understand it that I find interesting and worth engaging with, which is why I can't say that I'm not Buddhist. So Thompson's argument then, in his book, he starts off quite early by saying that since I didn't want to join a traditional Theravada, Zen, or Tibetan Buddhist monastery, the only way to be a Buddhist was to be a Buddhist modernist. And he says that although the context of my critique is Buddhism in the modern world, the scope of my critique is Buddhist modernism, or more precisely Buddhist modernism in Europe and North America, since Asia is evolving its own unique forms of Buddhist modernism. My critical arguments apply to European and American Buddhist modernism, not to every form of Buddhism or Buddhism as a whole. So perhaps the book should have had a less pithy title then of Why I Am Not a Buddhist Modernist, or a modern Buddhist maybe, but he talks about Buddhist modernism, and that's what I'll be unpacking a little bit more slightly later in the talk. So here's a photo of Professor Thompson. He defines Buddhist modernism in the following way, and we have to wait until towards the very last pages of the book to have a very clear definition of what he's talking about. He talks about Buddhist modernism as being a mind science. It claims that Buddhism is a mind science, that there is no self. Again, I don't think that Buddhists or even Buddhist modernists say that. I think Buddhist modernists are always careful to say no fixed self, or Buddhists in general talk about no fixity of self. The Buddha himself has warned against extreme nihilism, to say that there is no self, or an eternalism, a belief in a soul that exists after one is dead. And the Buddha has claimed that what he is offering us is a middle path between those two poles, between the nihilism that says there is no such thing as a self, and the eternalism that believes in a soul that exists after successive rebirths. So Buddhists generally speak, when they're speaking English, are very careful to say there's no fixed self. And they understand ontology very much, I think, in the lines of performativity, habitual ways of behaving and interacting and thinking, for which there is no original, but we are born into and socialized in these particular ways as we are developed by our cultures and our families. He also says he takes issue with Buddhism that claims that mindfulness is an inward awareness of one's own private mental theater. And he's quite strong on this point. He says that meditation techniques are actually a way of training the mind and developing the mind. And I agree with him. Certainly in all of the traditional texts and the ways in which people are taught meditation by Buddhist teachers, they're certainly introduced to meditation techniques as ways of cultivating positive mental states. But there are also meditation techniques that are around observing the mind, observing how cognition, and certainly how that broader nebulous hard question of consciousness works. So there's at least two different tracks in meditation techniques in Buddhism. A resting awareness of awareness itself. So what Locke Kelly would describe as an unhooking of local awareness, what we'd call everyday consciousness, to try and rest in a sense of awake awareness, a broader consciousness that exists outside of one's sense of fixed self. So I think his targets around mindfulness solely being an inward awareness of one's own private mental theater is in fact not quite accurate. It is that, and it is the mind training into positive mental states, as he rightfully says. He also takes issue with the claim that neuroscience establishes the value of mindfulness practice. He sees this as a central claim of Buddhist modernism, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. That enlightenment is a non-conceptual experience outside language, culture, tradition, and that enlightenment is or can be correlated with a brain state. And he says all of these are philosophically and scientifically indefensible. Well, you know, Buddhists claim to, you know, Buddhist teachings around ontology have been philosophically defended and debated for 2,500 years. So I don't think they can say that we can kind of dismiss them as merely indefensible. I've talked a little bit about how meditation practices have at least two different kind of twin tracks. Again, I don't see how we can say that they're philosophically and scientifically indefensible. And then the science that he alludes to is interesting, and he's got very, very interesting things to say about this science. So we'll have a look in later slides about what he calls this NeuralBuddhism. So he terms, he coins this kind of new phrase, NeuralBuddhism, that I find extremely interesting, which is that the brain is the site of it's a particular view of our cognition. And what I find interesting about his kind of scathing attacks on what he calls NeuralBuddhism, which is arguments made by cognitive scientists that argue for the benefits of meditation techniques on things like memory, calm, stress reduction, coping with chronic and acute pain states, being of use in healing from trauma, of other kinds of mental and psychological distress, that all of the scientific evidence that's marshaled to make these claims, he seems to argue very vehemently in some parts of his book that this is bogus science. This is interesting for a number of different points of view, not least the fact that Thompson himself was one of the co-authors of an extremely influential book. The second edition has come out just 3 years ago from MIT Press. It's called The Embodied Mind, Cognitive Science and Human Experience. It was initially published in 1991, and it led John Kabat-Zinn to, as he says himself in the foreword to the second edition, to really, it gave him great encouragement in his research and application of meditation techniques to reduce physical pain and mental anguish and stress. So it seems that the kind of NeuralBuddhism that he is critiquing, that he was in fact one of the significant co-founders of this path. Thompson also worked for many, many years with, indeed was one of the kind of original participants in what is known as the Mind Life Institute, which brings together scientists, Buddhist scholars, teachers, monks. The main kind of personality, if you like, who's part of this is the Dalai Lama, the current Dalai Lama. And the Mind Life Institute is particularly interested in magnetic resonance imaging of what happens to brain activities during deep meditative states, and comparing the effects of mindfulness-based stress reduction techniques with control groups of people who don't have that particular training, in terms of how those techniques help with things like concentration and memory and pain reduction. So he seems to have been one of the, from kind of my amateur point of view, he seems to have been kind of one of the founders of all of this so-called NeuralBuddhism. But he makes, not in his book, but in a blog where he's responding to some criticism of his book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist, he makes a very interesting point that his work to date, he doesn't consider it to be NeuralBuddhism, in that it's not brain focused per se, even though he's a cognitive scientist. He says he's an active cognitive scientist, that is, that he understands that cognition is constituted in the relation between the activity of the whole body and its environment, and not by the brain per se. So he made these defenses of his criticism on the very good Indian philosophy blog. He says that he never thought that the value of meditation or the meaning of enlightenment are matters that neuroscience can decide. So this is a key point of why he's not a Buddhist. He thinks that the claims made by Buddhism, certainly Buddhist modernists, to say that meditation has really positive effects and that it's valuable are things that actually neuroscience cannot decide. And I'll defer to him. He's the inactive cognitive scientist, and if he thinks that a lot of this claims made by his colleagues are in fact erroneous, I'd be interested to hear more. It's not part of why I find Buddhism particularly interesting or of meaning or of value. My impulse is to agree with Thompson that claims that there is such a thing as a brain state that can be captured in magnetic resonance imaging, where we can see what an enlightened brain looks like, just seems to me to be facetious at best. And then I'll be talking a little bit later about what I understand as enlightenment. Again, I think it's kind of different to the understandings of enlightenment that Thompson seems to have. Another area in which I would find myself certainly on firmer ground in agreeing with Thompson is in his irritation, though he's a rather deeper irritation than I would have, on what he calls Buddhist exceptionalism. And again, this isn't contained in his book per se. I had to go outside the book to get a more kind of pithy example of what he was talking about. He goes on at some length in the book, but this is on a Yale University Press blog. My principal objection is to what I call Buddhist exceptionalism, which is he says it's a fundamental part of Buddhist modernism. I kind of disagree with that, but this exceptionalism is a belief that Buddhism is superior to other religions in being inherently rational and empirical, or claims that Buddhism isn't really a religion, but rather is a kind of mind science based on meditation, or is a superior path toward realizing the ineffable and non-conceptual nature of things. I certainly have sympathies for Thompson's irritation here. I mean, any kinds of claims to exceptionalism, particularly in the area of religion, I think are possibly dangerous. That can lead to sectarianism. We've seen religious wars for millennia across our globe. The idea that you have right and purity on your side and everybody else is at least lesser is extremely dangerous. And at the very best, irritating. I also think that you know, he's right. There are certain commentators in the West who do seem to take a certain smug relish in claiming that Buddhism is rational and empirical and therefore isn't really a religion, and also doesn't have a creator God, and therefore is above religion. And much better than any other kinds of spiritual practices. And in fact, it's not even a spiritual practice at all. It's some kind of, you know, pragmatic philosophy. It's a guide to a human flourishing and living life well. These kind of claims are made by people like who generally style themselves to be secular Buddhists. And I agree with Thompson that if you are to claim that Buddhism isn't really a religion, you're going to miss out on a lot of the traditional teachings of Buddhism that stress devotion, that stress attachment to transcendental states, or not attachment rather, but aspiration towards transcendental states, that have a lot of instruction on devotion, and have a lot of practices that are religious in terms of being devotional and inculcating particular spiritual, transcendental values and states of mind. So I think his points on Buddhist exceptionalism aren't perhaps, from my point of view, particularly well made within the book, but in his summary on the Yale University Press blog site, I think are well made. However, in his responses to criticisms of the book on the Indian philosophy blog, and the person he was particularly in dialogue with was Amod Lele, who's an independent scholar, though is affiliated with Boston University. It finally becomes clear something that seemed to me to be implicit, but not explicitly stated in his book, in that his target isn't in particular Buddhist exceptionalism, nor is it indeed even how he styles Buddhist modernism. It seems eventually clear, and it only becomes clear, though he says there's hints on page 80 to 82 and again on page 158, that actually fundamentally he doesn't agree with Buddhist core tenets. So in the Indian philosophy blog, he says, let me take this opportunity to state explicitly something I only allude to in the book. I submit that the driving engine, historically and philosophically, of Buddhist thought is the following set of propositions, and he kind of repeats it in two ways. So all conditioned and compounded things are impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not self. They're the three lakshanas, or so-called marks of physical existence. And he calls nirvana unconditioned peace. Again, I have a different definition of nirvana. I kind of prefer the more etymologically correct idea of nirvana, which is a quenching or cessation, to be a concept that I understand better, rather than this idea of unconditioned peace. Another formulation of these core Buddhist tenets are the four seals. So he's drawing from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, whereby they define a view as Buddhist if you understand that everything conditioned and compounded is impermanent. Everything contaminated by mental afflictions of the three toxins of greed, hatred, and delusion. All phenomena are devoid of intrinsic identity or self. And again, he calls nirvana an unconditioned cessation of affliction. The fundamental reason I'm not a Buddhist is that I don't accept these propositions, including their modernist renditions, and my philosophical project doesn't include trying to reformulate them in acceptable modernist terms. So I think finally in his rebuttal to Lele, we get actually the fact that it's not just that he's not a Buddhist modernist, it's not just that he doesn't think his life can be amenable to entering a monastery. It's not that actually he thinks that kind of what's happening in Asia in terms of an Asian Buddhist modernism is something that he can go along with philosophically. He comes up with what he calls a cosmopolitanism as an answer. In other words, from his particular viewpoint, he can be a liberal and be prepared to engage and hear out Buddhists, whether they're modernists in Asia, whether they're modernists in Europe or North America, but fundamentally he does not agree with basic Buddhist propositions. Though, you know, very rich cultures, 2,500 years old, let's have them in the world. So they add to a sense of cosmopolitan, internationalist humanism. And so that's the only ground really in which he is personally or intellectually prepared to engage with Buddhist tenets. So I want to offer, before I go on, so this is the second of the three parts of my talk, I want to offer a more, what I consider to be a more complete picture of Buddhism in our modernity and even our post-modernity. I think Thompson's particular depiction of Buddhist modernism starts and stops with what he himself has coined NeuralBuddhism. And I want to offer this picture because I think it's interesting, and I think it's a more, you know, if the only book you're going to read is Thompson's, I do want you to know that there's actually a wider view of how we might, of what we might call Buddhist modernity. So the oldest tradition of Buddhist practice and doctrine and teaching, philosophy, if you will, is Theravadan. Works with the Pali Canon. It's now largely found in Sri Lanka. And that is called, somewhat dismissively, I would think, the Hinayana tradition as well, by the next turning of the wheel, turning the next revolution in Buddhist practice and thinking, which is the Mahayana tradition, which is, Mahayana is the great vehicle or the great raft, as opposed to the Hinayana, which is the narrow vehicle or the narrow raft. And the Mahayanas felt, so this would typically kind of have been about kind of 500 to 800 years after the Theravadan tradition was flourishing, initially throughout from northern India, where the Buddha did his teachings for about 30 years. The Mahayana is found coming into Tibet, but also into China, has the Chan tradition, and then into Japan and Korea, the Zen tradition. And the Mahayana accused the Hinayana people, the Theravadins, of being just focused on individual liberation from suffering, cessation of craving, which is nirvana. And they were offering up their practice for the greater liberation of all sentient beings. Now, I personally think it's a little bit mean of the Mahayana people to dismiss the Theravadins in that way, because individual enlightenment was understood by them too to be of great benefit and effect for all sentient beings. But the Mahayanas really stress this, and they have a whole kind of new development of cosmology, more teachings, and the development of the ideal of the Bodhisattva. That is, those of us who've been raised Christians, perhaps an idea of a saint who's focused their practice and their achievement of enlightenment to the benefit of others. So they're going to use all of their practice to liberate other people from their suffering. And the Vajrayana is again considered a new whole revolution and cycle of the wheel, and that's most associated with the tantric practices of Tibetan Buddhism. So most Buddhists who are serious and engaged with the traditions of Buddhism, as we understand them, moving through Southeast Asia and Far East Asia, from my Eurocentric perspective, describing those regions in that way, we would now understand ourselves to be in what's called the fourth turning of the wheel, a fourth yana. And that is a new revision of Buddhist practice, both in its traditional sites in Asia, and also a coming of Buddhist teachers, practices, and the development of Buddhist communities in North and South America, Europe and Australasia, into places where we haven't seen Buddhism before the end of the 19th century, and certainly the and the 20th century. So I do agree that we are in a new and particular moment of Buddhism, and I'm very happy to call it a Buddhist modernity, to mark Buddhism, teaching practice and doctrine coming into, let's call it, Western cultures. So a wonderful book on this, published about 12 years ago now, by Oxford University Press, by David McMahon, The Making of Buddhist Modernism, has been very influential and indeed considered very helpful by Buddhist practitioners outside the academy as well as inside the academy, in terms of describing this new phase, this fourth revolution of the Dharmic wheel, that we're kind of agreeing to call Buddhist modernism. So he takes the political philosopher Charles Taylor's kind of three marks, three lakshanas, if you like, of how we kind of understand modernity. The three main discourses, as Taylor describes them, of modernity in the Western world or the global North. But mind you, I also want to include Latin America in that, where Buddhism is really growing exponentially. So there's scientific rationalism, romanticism and transcendentalism. Again, these two discourses tend to kind of pull against each other or clash at times. And Charles Taylor would make an argument for also including the Protestantism as we find it kind of at the end of the 17th century in Europe, and it's, though he doesn't stress it, though I will, it's part in global capitalism, and I would also see it as its part in colonialism. So, but Taylor doesn't speak about Protestantism in these terms. He speaks about Protestantism as a way in which people are empowered to interpret scriptures and doctrines for themselves and to form more egalitarian peer support groups for their spiritual practice. And that certainly is in terms of the development of Christianity, a radical break with the more traditional Roman Catholic view of how doctrine was to be imparted to a laity from a revered clergy. And so these three discourses then are tracked by McMahon, and he looks at how Buddhism coming from Eastern cultures deals with, interacts with, and sometimes borrows the clothes from, is how Thompson would see it, these main discourses of the West, or I would put it a little bit more differently in that makes itself intelligible as a doctrine, as a spiritual practice, as a practical philosophy by speaking through the main understandings of scientific rationalism, romanticism, transcendentalism, and the values of an empowered Protestant critical view of received wisdom. I think McMahon, he alludes to it slightly in talking about how William James was so influential in bringing Buddhism into the United States of America. I think he misses a trick in terms of not talking more about how psychology as a discourse of modernity has also been very much a place where Buddhism has had an enormous engaged hybridization or impact. It's been able to take up the discourses, particularly of positive psychology, of cognitive behavioral therapy. Those kinds of ways of approaching psychology have both been influenced by Buddhism practice and also have kind of created a new hybrid, particularly distinct modern Buddhism. And I also think democratic egalitarianism, maybe we can include it under Protestantism, but that's also been an important vehicle or value-making system that traditional Buddhist teachings have found very amenable to the spread of traditional Dharma. Okay. So I'm going to be looking at this kind of framework in the next slide in more detail. And here I just want to introduce the framework that I'm going to be using. So in order to really get a better picture of what I'm calling Buddhist modernism, I've borrowed this graphic from three Buddhist teachers who ran a very interesting talk just last January, even though January 2020 feels like 4 years ago now. A very interesting talk on their understanding of Buddhist modernism, again, picking up on McMahon's book. And that workshop was held in England in a place called Adishton in Herefordshire. I can pass you on the link to some of the talks that were publicly had there. So a very good framework for understanding Buddhist modernism, I think, is this particular one that they introduced. In other words, we can see that a lot of people who have started to engage in Buddhist practice in the West can be placed on a grid, if you like, between neo-traditionalist people who find the transcendental metaphysical goals of Buddhism to be something to aspire to. So to live in a state of fully awake awareness, to reside in a mind that is as clear as and free from delusion as any Buddha, and to live with an open heart full of metta or dynamic loving kindness for all sentient beings. That is their goal, enlightenment or bust, and they have particular kind of sets of beliefs and particular ways of looking towards authority structures to help them in this practice. And then there are other people in the who are Western practitioners of Buddhism who would have a more imminent goal. In other words, they're more recognizable as kind of traditional liberal humanists, and their sets of beliefs and the way that they look to authorize those beliefs and for guidance on their practice is different in distinct ways from what we might call the neo-traditionalist. So let's have a look at a more full spread of what I consider those to be. So these are kind of more my glosses than anybody else's. So quite happy to be told I'm missing tricks here or I'm not clear. So the neo-traditionalist then is aiming for an awake awareness, a cessation from an orientation to become is one way that you could traditionally describe this. A happy abiding, to live without any craving, a quenching of all craving, which is a way in which you can understand the etymology of nirvana. To be a bodhi, that is to live with the experience of awake awareness, what has been translated in the West as enlightenment. And this is where we're getting into some of the ways in which Buddhism has been able to engage with discourses of modernity. So that kind of great goal of European modernity of enlightenment, Buddhism is now largely understood to be a science or practice of this great European 18th century goal. Again, this is something in particular that Thompson would find, though he doesn't expressly state it as such, would find most irritating about Buddhist modernism in the West. So the neo-traditionalists among us who practice Buddhism in the West would look to devotion to their teachers, devotion to the Pali scriptures, the Pali canon. They would have a kind of what we might describe as a confessional orientation towards Buddhism. They are Buddhists. They would be reverent, understand their practice as duties and obedience to doctrine and tenets. They would have belief in non-human agents, supernatural phenomena, the intervention of bodhisattvas, so they can appeal and pray to those forms of agency to come and help them. Side by side in the exact same kind of meditation class or the exact same Buddhist grouping, meditating alongside them can be another group of people who are much more recognizable to us as liberal humanists. They have a more imminent goal. They're quite content to deal with the messy reality of life and have Buddhism help them out there. They're interested in psychological wellness. They're interested in eudaimonistic Buddhism, more kind of recognizably Greek, Aristotelian, Epicurean, Stoic version of Buddhism. And this has been developed a lot by people like Stephen Batchelor, who is quite content to leave an awful lot of the more esoteric, or even I would say central Buddhist teachings, such as, for example, around karma, completely to one side, and instead take some of the practices of Buddhism and bring them back into the West by yoking them to some of the classical Greek philosophical schools. So more pragmatic, applied, practical philosophy. We can also call it secular Buddhism, as Batchelor would like to call it, or indeed even engaged Buddhism, such as a lot of the environmental Buddhism or the anti-capitalist or critiquing of capitalism. So their goals, in other words, are quite different from the neo-traditionalist goals. They would delight in the fact that Buddhism seems to eschew a lot of the metaphysical messy questions. So the Buddha famously chose not to answer metaphysical questions concerning time and space, issues around personal autonomy and identity, and life after death, or creator gods, or so all of that. Buddha taught, famously refused to answer those questions because he said that was not what he was teaching. What he was teaching was how to, what the Dalai Lama is called the art of happiness, or how not to suffer. So they like that Buddhism seems much more amenable to natural laws and facts than other spiritual paths or tradition. And that a lot of Buddhist teaching does rely on people consciously developing a reflective practice to check with how the mind trainings of meditation, or how meditation as a way to understand better consciousness and break free of ignorance and delusion, particularly around fixed self, that this relates to our own kind of empiricism, that it seems to map completely onto Kant's invocation to sapere aude, that it is around reason and our own empiricism. So we can term, the bottom half of the screen, if you like, a form of Neoplatonism, is about as close as it may get to transcendental aspirations. The other kind of side would be much more accepting of devotion and ritual. And I think, one of the important things that definitely McMahon points out is that between the neo-traditionalist and the liberal humanist, there is often a shared commitment, even among the kind of the hard science rationalistic people. There can be discovered an acceptance of, if not their own practice of romanticization, but other people's need or wish or benefit in terms of engaging in particular forms of what we would recognize right throughout Europe from the end of the 18th century. This quote is from Novalis, one of my favorite German romantics. The need to romanticize the world, the need to give the glow of infinity to the finite, as Novalis says. So there be at least some tolerance of other people's romantic expressions in their Buddhist practice. So the discourses of postmodernity it's just last year, a very interesting book came out. Again, I think it was with Yale, yes, it was with Yale. American Dharma. It's kind of ethnographic and philosophical, looking at what she calls Buddhism beyond modernity. And again, I think this is another kind of way in which we can understand Buddhist modernism, particularly in America. There is a huge awareness there of what I think is a very modern phenomena, and that is, it's one of the ways in which I teach kind of 18th century and the rupture between the pre-modern and early modern, is that you get a definite new use of the word generation. It no longer merely means to make something grow. It means that you belong to a particular temporal group by virtue of the fact that you have were born in the same cluster of years, and therefore are assumed to have a particular kind of outlook, interest, and indeed a shared project in disrupting or critiquing or rejecting, certainly at least evaluating the pieties and values that have been handed down to you from your parents' generation. And you and your peer group will, if you like, reinvent the world or romanticize the world or take on the project of deciding for yourself what things are of value and how meaning should be accrued to certain values and practices, social and cultural practices. I think that's a very, very modern sense of, you just don't see it, honestly, guys, before 1690. It's a new way of being human in the world. So this is kind of following from modernity, postmodernity, if you like. We now have an acute awareness of, some of us do anyway, of what particular, or certainly in the States, of what particular generation we belong to. And so we can see within American Dharma, the millennials, such as Buddhist geeks, for example, who have big conferences and podcasts using social media in particular ways, and are seriously interrogating a lot of the received wisdom that have come not merely from their Japanese teachers who came in the 50s and taught the baby boomers, but in fact, what the Gen X people my generation, are saying to them about Buddhism, and have declared its kind of free reign for millennial Buddhists to engage with game theory, with gaming, with hallucinogenic drugs, a lot of things that I would think would, from my Gen X point of view, have been cautioned by the precepts. But in any case, they are remaking Buddhism in a very kind of self-conscious, generational way. I think, and I don't have time to go into it here because I would have a lot to say about it. I think one of the things that Anne Clegg points out, and certainly in podcasts takes up in very interesting ways, is that we haven't fully appreciated the post-colonial, or indeed the colonial or ethnocentric dynamics that led to Buddhism coming in at a particular time to encounter Western cultures. And I think that this, the ways in which Westerners feel so free to reject, pick and choose, hybridize, let's say culturally appropriate, particular forms of Buddhism, I find worrying. And I also see as a particular kind of hallmark, that kind of liberty, a particularly worrying hallmark of Buddhist modernism, but it's a worry that's actually shared by a lot of practicing Buddhists in the West, particularly in more recent years. And again, with Black Lives Matter movement taking off, particularly this year, I guess, but in more recent years, more and more white Western Buddhists have been paying attention to this aspect of Buddhist modernism. I think we're only beginning to see something that I think is central in Buddhism, which is a critique of how we relate to the environment, and particularly the ways in which we engage with other non-sentient beings, or sorry, other sentient beings, with, I think, an implicit critique, not merely of farming, but of capitalism. So again, these are aspects of how Buddhism is making itself manifest in the West, and the ways in which it is engaging with discourses, and indeed changing the discourses we have, hybridizing new forms of knowledge and spiritual practice. So I have spoken for far too long. I promised to only speak for half an hour, and I'm double that. So why I'm not a Buddhist, I'm going to absolutely fly through this. I'm going to just take another 5 minutes. I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. So this is all you have to say, guys, if you want to become a Buddhist. In other words, I place trust in the idea that I have Buddha nature, that I can develop, so that I can live in awake awareness and have an open, unconditioned heart that's full of metta and loving kindness. I at least take refuge in the ideal of that. So it's not even taking refuge in the historical Buddha, it's taking refuge in my own Buddha seed. Again, a very perhaps modernist take. I take refuge in the Dharma, in the teachings that have come from all of the various Buddhist traditions and are so brilliantly synthesized and conveyed by many, many excellent Dharma teachers. And the Sangha. I take refuge in at least the idea, and certainly the practice too, in my case, of spiritual friendship, of developing a peer support for spiritual practice. I find a lot of inspiration in the Buddha's description of his project for his teaching, which is that he teaches how suffering arises for humans and how to end suffering. And the root of all suffering, according to Buddha, is craving, or what's also described as a desire to become. And that he offers an eightfold path and a number of very simple precepts and teachings on that eightfold path in order to at least diminish, if not actually extinguish, that suffering. So I find the laws of conditioned co-production, the laws of karma, very compelling. And I like how meditation and the practice of meditation for me both reveals how consciousness works. And certainly I've had really good teachers who've helped me to achieve various jhanic states that seem very insightful. And also just on the mundane, day-to-day beneficial mind training. So the last slides, which I'm happy to share with those of you who want them, are basically a summary of the precepts and of the 8 steps, a summary of conditioned co-production and the laws of karma. I think it's really important to state that karma, and certainly as Thompson talks about it in his book, is not this is not fully encapsulated in the idea that our own actions will mean that we will have particular and definite certain things happen for us and to us. That particular version of karma, that our own intent and focus on how we, the intent we're bringing into our action, has a certain amount of effect on how our life will go. But it's not the complete picture of the ways in which our life is impacted. So there isn't, and the Buddha is quite expressly clear on this. In, for example, in a discourse to King Melinda, that whoever says that, you know, your intentional volitional action causes all of the consequences that you deal with in your life is utterly mistaken. And I think that Thompson is rather unfair in how he talks about karma as only being understood in that particular way. I won't say anything about rebirth unless we have times in the question. I have some graphics there on it. And then I just want to end on the final slide. So the title of my talk is Why I'm Not a Buddhist, but I haven't actually said I am a Buddhist, except I suppose by implication or maybe in a rushed way in this talk. I tend to say I practice Buddhism, and that isn't just a matter of being coy. There are two reasons for me not fully taking on I am a Buddhist. At least two reasons. One of them is I had a very good teacher when I was practicing Zen Buddhism in San Francisco. And he taught that it takes Buddhism 200 years to enter into a particular culture. And that in the West, we are at the, we're barely started with the translation of Buddhism into a culture, and that wherever Buddhism has gone, it is very much engaged with the dominant discourses within that culture and hybridized and become rooted in very specific ways, depending on the culture in which it arrives into, and that it takes about 200 years for it to become kind of cellular, if you like, in the visible and practiced and understood generally and clearly, if you like, among a culture. And so it seems at least presumptuous to say in this lifetime I'm a Buddhist, given my temporal and geographical position. And the second reason is I'm also mindful of the teaching of the Dalai Lama, who sometimes seems rather alarmed at the rate in which Westerners are engaging with Buddhism, and will often repeat that, the West, certainly the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, as far as he's concerned, offer everything that Buddhism would be able to offer in terms of spiritual goals and human flourishing. He doesn't particularly see why Buddhism is taking such kind of fervent hold among some Westerners. And I think it's, I'm one of these Buddhists who's kind of very reluctantly and not quite left Catholicism. And I've left it largely for political reasons. It's very difficult to be a woman within Roman Catholicism. I don't need to say any more about that. But I also, the more I practice Buddhism, the more I am certain that the kinds of spiritual progression and benefits I'm experiencing in practicing Buddhism, I can see those being very clearly open to somebody who doesn't have the same political barriers to belonging in the Roman Catholic Church. I think if you were to live with the love of Jesus in your heart, if you could find a practice and community whereby you were able to do that, you would have all of the spiritual benefits, as far as I'm concerned, that Buddhism can offer. So in terms of Dharma, then, I like the why am I clinging to Buddhist Dharma? It's just I need spiritual practice. I'm not already a saint, and I'd like to be. I want something to hold, and the root of Dharma is that dr. And I want to kind of close with a quote from one of my favorite poets, Zizimborska. There are two different translations there from one of her later poems. And for me, I could be saying, well, what is philosophy anyway? Or what is spiritual practice anyway? And more than one rickety answer has tumbled since that question was first asked. But I just keep on not knowing. And as she says herself, not knowing doesn't mean that you can't know. And I cling to that not knowing. I do not know and do not know, and clutch onto it like a redemptive banister. Okay, thank you very much, and sorry for going on so long.
Thank you, Katherine, for that fascinating talk. So the question and answer we're in a webinar, not a meeting, which means that things work a little differently. You can, if you'd rather not speak, you can type your question into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your hand by clicking on participants. And if you raise your hand, then I will promote you to the panel, in which case you'll be able to use your video and audio. So either raise your hand or feel free also to type a question into the Q&A. And I think we have a question in the Q&A. Oh, no, it's not. It's someone who has to leave. So Maeve has a question. Okay, very good. So I'm going to.
And there's a question, there's a comment that's really interesting from.
Oh, yes. If you'd like to address that comment first, that might be best, because that came in earlier in the chat section. Yes.
Yeah. Why should we keep invoking justifications to emulate or refute from a more authentic Puritan sources anyway, if they exist? Yeah, I agree. I mean, Buddhism, as I understand your comment, and you know, very happy to hear from you. If I've misrepresented it, I don't think we need to necessarily worry about appropriation. I suppose what I was talking about in that particular moment when I was having a worry about cultural appropriation was the ways in which some Western Buddhists felt so free to disregard some of the central teachings of Buddhism because they wanted to make it more Western. So Stephen Batchelor's desire to make it more secular, for example. So it seems to me maybe I shouldn't have put the worry as cultural appropriation, but maybe a kind of an ethnocentric dismissal. I find a little bit worrying.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, and Maeve, you should be able to turn on your audio and or visual.
Hi, Maeve.
Hi, Catherine. Thank you. I actually don't have a question, at least not yet. It was just probably a comment. Or your last slide just resonated with something I had just been reading during the week, and I don't think it probably speaks for itself. It's something I've been puzzling over, and your last quotation from the poet resonated. During the week, I was reading, not for the first time, about a correspondence between the two philosophers, Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers, in I think it was the 1930s, and maybe it was even the 1920s. And Heidegger wrote to Jaspers that Heidegger's mother had asked Heidegger on her deathbed to return to his faith, to give up philosophy and to return to his faith, to promise her that. And Heidegger felt unable to do it. He thought, you know, that would be, he would be in some way, I don't know what was going on. But anyway, Jaspers wrote to Heidegger. Heidegger was distressed, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't make this promise to his mother. Jaspers wrote to Heidegger and said this is the resonance. He said, conscious, something like this, I'm quoting from memory, conscious of not knowing, I would be able to acknowledge the belief of a loved one as truth.
Yeah, lovely.
That's all.
Yeah, and that's where I think, you know, what Thompson says about Buddhist exceptionalism is really great, because their certainty of their superiority is, I think, well, I don't think it's Buddhist even. I just think that kind of a hierarchy of certainties is it's not the place where you do philosophy anyway, is it?
Perhaps my question is, now it's helped me to say a question is, so because I've been puzzling over this, what is it about the consciousness of not knowing? So this is a particular example. And I think what Jaspers meant to say was, it allows me to relate in a different way to the world, and in particular to a loved one, and to embrace, but it has a cognitive dimension. I'm able to embrace a body of belief which I actually think is untrue as truth in that moment. And it's not a deception, it's actually, it enables me to perceive something about this body of knowledge. So I don't know how it works, but it seems very interesting, and it seemed to be in some way connected with the kind of things you were talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Maeve. Yeah, I know I was reading something by Sally Haslanger today, and she uses just in an article, she was using truth, and then in the next sentence she talked about it as fact, as if they were synonyms for each other. And there's something about truth that seems to me that it's not always entirely factual, and perhaps that comes back to the place I wanted to keep for Romanticism, for that kind of openness to the transcendent, to the mystery. I think if we don't have that, we're in danger of settling for facts rather than bigger truths, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Anyway, so thank you. Yeah, thank
you.
you.
Thanks, Maeve.
Thank you, Maeve. And we have a question as well from Sylvia. Sylvia, fire away.
Hi.
Hey, lovely to see you.
Thank you so much. There was a lot there, and I'm not sure that I have a very intelligible question, but here are some things that I would like to know what you think about. So you said a lot of different things about disagreements within Buddhism and between different traditions in Buddhism, and then a personal take. And I was trying to tie all the strands together, and I was thinking about three aspects of Buddhism that somehow encapsulate the difficulties. One is the ontology or metaphysics. So what is it that we think about the world, that is impermanent, that there is no such thing as a permanent self, and so on. Another is what we can call an ethic, I suppose, which is, well, what do you do once you think that way about the world? How do you live? How do you spend your life, and how do you think? And the third is a sense of a goal. What do you do it for? Mm-hmm. And whilst the disagreement about the first one is very interesting, I would like to know more about what you think about the third aspect, meaning the purpose of it, because that reverberates in the other aspects as well. The goal that you're trying to attain then will also change your understanding of the practice and on the way of life. And there too, I mean, I can't fully wrap my head around whether there is any hierarchy between the self-improvement, the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of goodness for others, or authenticity. So whether you have an idea about what the goal is or should be, or whether there are many goals and they all operate on the same level.
The goal is enlightenment. You know, the goal is nirvana. And according to the Buddha and the teachers who followed him, Buddhism is a developmental path. So you're promised, you know, improvements, so long as you keep that goal. And the ethic, again, I didn't have time to go into it. It would be, obviously I can't talk for less than 50 minutes at a time. That's embarrassing. But anyway, the part that I find most interesting at the moment in terms of Buddhist Western interpreters of Buddhism is that particular crowd, including John Kabat-Zinn, but a whole load of psychologists working out of Harvard University who've done long-term training with Buddhist teachers who talk about ontology in extremely interesting ways, and they're therapists of kind of various kinds, working with broken human psyches. And they say that the first thing that they need to do quite often is to build people's ego up, as we understand that in a kind of Western psychotherapeutic way, before they can give them the message, and now you need to learn how to relax your ego defenses. So that's, I hope, like a good way of answering your question. You can't go straight into a lot of us, certainly people in the West, who have so much kinds of psychological suffering, with the liberating message that you're not a fixed self. that can be utterly the wrong thing to hear. So that's quite a sophisticated and evolved practice, and you need a lot of meditation before you even introduce that idea. And a lot of us need an awful lot of sorting out properly around good boundaries and effective ways to relate to people before we even get into that kind of stage of practice, I'd suggest. In terms of an ethic, well, the goal is enlightenment. And what I love about the goal of enlightenment is, as the Dalai Lama says, it promises you happiness, but it's happiness of such a profound kind that it doesn't matter what arrows come, you can accept them with equanimity. You don't do the second arrow trick that we're all very good at, particularly in the West, of beating yourself up because affliction has befallen you. You have the psychological, if you want to use that word, capacity to accept all suffering and even invite suffering, if you're a bodhisattva, other people's suffering on, so you can purify it. But if the goal isn't enlightenment, the goal isn't to live in a radiantly clear mind with an open and compassionate heart, you're not going to get any of the kind of short-term goals of moderate happiness and making less mistakes. Does that make sense? Does that answer? And the ethic is to have really good relations with yourself, others, and all sentient beings. That's the ethic. That's the presumption, if you like, of how you want to behave.
So just quickly, so in the goal of enlightenment, you would include both a moral element and a spiritual element, and if you like, a psychological element. It's kind of a whole.
I suppose, you know, the Mahayana people have told us that we can't just be about an individual enlightenment. And I think, you know, I think all Buddhists kind of accept that's an unskillful way to think about enlightenment, of just thinking about it for yourself. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Sylvia. And we have another question in the Q&A from Alison McCone, and she says, one of the goals some modern Buddhists seem to aim for is to help them prepare for death, but I believe a study of Buddhist monks by cognitive psychologists found that their fear was not lessened as they gained enlightenment over time. What's your opinion of how Buddhist practices address end-of-life issues?
Lovely question, Alison. I mean, I don't know about that study about cognitive psychologists. I've worked as a paid employee in two different hospices, the Zen hospice in San Francisco. But my mentor there was a Venezuelan nun, a very old little lady, and she was absolutely wonderful at leading people through death. And the other place I worked was in a hospice here in Cork. And again, that was a Catholic hospice, and people were led through their death really well. So I think the Buddhist Tibetan tradition has very, very, very clear practices for leading people through the stages of death. And anybody will tell you who's seen a lot of people die, certainly in hospital or hospice situations, there's very clear demarcations when people are leaving us. You know, I don't want to get too esoteric about it, but you can, if you've seen lots of people die, you know when people are moving, what next stage they've moved to, and you know when death is coming close. So the Tibetans have really made quite a science of this and have different practices and prayers for each of those bargains, for each of those gaps or stages. But, you know, having seen people die in Catholic hospices as well, you know, they can also be led through by people even without those sophisticated Tibetan practices. And I'm sorry to hear that the Buddhist monks didn't have any fear lessened, but maybe that's because they weren't actually dying. You know, we don't often know how people are going to die. I think from my anecdotal experience, people die as they live, to be honest. I know one of our colleagues, Lisa Foran talks about trying to prepare herself for the nursing home and dementia, you know, that you start now by keeping a positive attitude towards the rest of your life so that you're ready when that happens later on in life. I think that if you were a sincere and engaged Buddhist, as in also a sincere and engaged spiritual follower, that you should be, most spiritual traditions should be able to help you have as best an attitude as you can towards that mysterious last journey. Hope that's answered.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Catherine. I might add a question of my own, if that's okay, Catherine.
Sure.
There's no other hands up right now. I really liked your kind of muddying of the waters between the distinction between a traditional Buddhist and a modernist Buddhist or a Western Buddhist. I thought that was, you introduced a lot of interesting ways of making that distinction. And I wondered whether, so one thing in that strikes me that could be a potential target for the sort of dismissive attitude that some people have towards modern Buddhism as practiced in the West is the idea that the focus, as you said, is, I think you mentioned this, of course, is on self-help in some sense. But, you know, so that, I suppose my question would be, the site of my ignorance around Buddhism in particular, as compared to the Abrahamic religions, is the point at which, or the extent to which one incurs duties by engaging with it. So this not just so I'm not trying to make a distinction between self-help and something else, because I think that's probably not a very good distinction, and you've nicely kind of demonstrated how that's not the way to sort of just carve up the cake, as it were, between traditional and modernist Buddhism. But I just wonder, what, for genuine curiosity, what's the extent to which, by engaging in Buddhism, one takes upon oneself duties that may or may, you know, the fulfillment of which may or may not be of benefit to you, as opposed to those which serve the goal of self-improvement in the very broad sense of self-improvement, including spiritual? Yeah,
that's a great question. Thanks a million, because I've skipped over very quickly the precepts and the 8 steps. So all you have to do to kind of be a Buddhist, if you like, is to sincerely take refuge with the idea that you have a Buddha nature, that you will look to the teachings for guidance, and that you will develop spiritual friendship with other people on the same path. And in terms of the precepts, if you like, what are the rules you're going to follow? There's traditionally just 5. And they are, again, traditionally given in both kind of a positive injunction and a negative. You will refrain from doing this, or you will positively do this. And I prefer the positive way. So the first one is with that so negatively it's described as you won't kill or harm. That's the first one. But I love the positive way of describing it. So with deeds of loving kindness, you will commit to your actions. And then the second one is you're not supposed to take the not given, which I think is very nicely put. But in the more positive injunction is you're going to be open-handed and generous. And then there's around defiling your body with sexual appetites or just all kinds of craving appetites of the body.
Yep.
And desire sensations. So the positive ways, you're going to be still, simple, and content. That's the aim for the actions of your body. And then you're not supposed to tell lies or untruths. There's a huge amount of teachings on skillful speech. So you have truthful communication. And then the 5th one is you're not to defile your mind with junk, with fake news or whatever, kind of Twitter, mindfulness, clear and radiant.
Yeah, that's lovely.
Yeah, so they're the precepts, and that's what you're supposed to be living by.
Okay, Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That's really interesting. Let me see, are there any other questions? Nothing in the Q&A, and unless anyone raises their hand, we will finish. I think that's it.
Yeah,
Well,
thanks.
in that case, thank you very much, Catherine,
You're welcome.
for a
Thanks, guys.
fantastic talk. And the recording will be available for if you know there are people who missed it and want to catch up. So I'll make the recording available to you, and then you can share it. So thank you so much for delivering the talk.
Thanks, Sylvia. You've lovely Buddhist hair, actually.
I was anticipating not getting to the hairdressers or the barbers for quite some time, so
yeah,
just in
I'm
case.
going on Thursday. Yeah.
Just in case.
Thanks for sticking with me, guys. And sorry we didn't have more time for chatting and I kept you so long, but thank you.
Well, I think a lot of people
you.
will probably want to speak to you afterwards anyway, and you might get emails and so thanks very much, Catherine. Fascinating.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye-bye.